Hello and welcome. It's been a while. I've been very busy. It's been very difficult to make a video in recent weeks. But this is just an attempt to articulate some things that are on my mind regarding the COVID-19 situation. Well, I'll start at the beginning of what my main concern is. Essentially, I've been extremely concerned with the measures that are being deployed by government regarding the talk of vaccine passports and travel restrictions, the vaccine apartheid, the vaccinated versus the non-vaccinated. But even more horrific is the push to try to keep everybody in masks, including children. Now, there's lots of evidence out there of why masks are not good psychologically, physically. The fibres, the plastics in the mask that people breathe in, the carcinogenic elements of it, the diktats of that you can wear a cloth mask, you don't have to wear a proper one that used by the doctors. Very unhygienic. I mean, many scientists have outlined why the human respiratory system was not designed that you wear a piece of cloth over your mouth and nose, for obvious reasons. And the reason I mention this is because I've recently wrote to the Scottish Government to ask a very, very important question, which I haven't heard, well, many people voice. They maybe have thought it, but I had to voice it. And essentially, the Scottish Government have not done any risk assessments on the use of masks for children in schools or for people in the general population. So therefore, I wrote to them with a very, very simple question. Now, in light of the fact that there's been no risk assessment for masks for children or for people, and that there's plenty of evidence out there to suggest that there are risks, health hazards, psychological and physical, and that the science for the use of them, to mandate them, is far from concrete, it's far from convincing. So I said to them, therefore, in light of this, if someone is harmed by wearing a mask, whether psychologically or physiologically, for a developing medical condition, chronic headaches, or a respiratory condition, or a mouth infection, or psychological trauma. In light of that, the possibility of that, and if someone comes forward, who is held accountable? Who in the Scottish Government, person or department, is the person or the department that the person should contact? The reply came back from the Scottish Government. It just highlighted that the World Health Organization science said there's no risks for masks, and that was that. There was no other discussion. But they didn't answer the question of who should one address if one is harmed. And I think that's very revealing. So I replied to them as I pointed this out. You never answered the question. I said my communication to you wasn't about a debate about the science of who's correct in regards to the science. But if someone is harmed by your mandates, of which there's been no risk assessment, who does one get in contact with in the Scottish Government? Who is to be held accountable? Who would deal with such a incident? I asked, like the vaccine, does the Scottish Government have indemnity for any harms caused by this mask mandate? And I also pointed out that the vaccine has indemnity, is experimental, and has no licence. And there's a growing list of adverse reactions listed on the MHRA website. And I said that I was very curious that none of this is really disseminated by the Scottish Government or Nicola Sturgeon in her daily briefings, or Jean Freeman, etc. I thought that was highly strange, considering informed consent for taking such a medicine is paramount. But these facts are somehow, well, it looks like forgotten in a cloud of cognitive dissonance. So I will wait to hear back from them to see what they've got to say. I mean, I'm just one person voicing my concern about this situation. There's many, many more. But I think it's mounting, the concerns, and there's many, many more people writing. I think it's quite evident the governments in the UK, they know that many, many people have cottoned on to the fact that they're not playing from the they're playing a rigged game. So that's my communication with the Scottish Government. But I've been doing a varied kind of reading diet in recent weeks for more inspiration, and I came across a very, very interesting book by a philosopher in Italy called Giorgio Agamben, and a book that he wrote called Where Are We Now? The Epidemic is Politics. Now, Agamben's a very interesting character to discuss because he is from the left of the intelligentsia, so to speak. He's kind of in the same ballpark as people like Slavoj Zizek, but as many commentators, cultural and political commentators on the left have shown over the past year, they seem to have been very pro-lockdown or not very questioning of the measures put in by governments, which is very surprising considering the destruction of a lot of our liberties and freedoms. And Giorgio Agamben has spoken out very well on this issue, and he's got himself in a lot of hot water by people on the left, unsurprisingly, because, well, my kind of theory is of why the left are kind of silent on this, and implicit with a lot of the measures is that maybe they see some sort of destruction of capitalism and or a universal basic income, kind of some sort of leisure stroke possible work utopia, equalisation, distribution of wealth kind of thing. But of course that argument falls flat on its face when the huge big multinational companies have made billions and billions in this scamdemic, and you know, it's the ordinary person, the small and medium-sized businesses who have been destroyed. ordinary people. And so therefore, I got this book because I'd read a few articles about him that he'd written, and articles written about him, and his take on the pandemic was very, very interesting. This was a question asked by a journalist to him. I think the journalist. This is one of the chapters in this book that I got. The journalist asked, "You belong to a section of the population for which the virus mortality rate seems to be between 10 and 20%, and not in the single digits. Are you scared when you encounter other people? Should this fear guide people's behaviours beyond the rules imposed by authorities?" Because this Agamben's quite old, he must be in his late 70s. And that's very interesting to note, because he has obviously, with the history of fascism in Italy, he's got a keen eye, and he has identified a lot of similar things going on now in Italy and in the world with the measures which to him reek of fascism, which is another interesting thing, because you would think most people on the left would be against this fascistic rise. Anyways, his response was, "The risk of contagion, in the name of which freedoms are limited, has never been specifically stated. The numbers communicated are intentionally vague, without any analysis in relation to the annual death rate or the definite causes of death." Very true. As would be essential if what was truly at stake was scientific. Exactly. Following the science they're not following the science. They're being intentionally vague on annual death rates and the causes of death with COVID, from COVID, etc. "I will answer you anyways with what Montaigne said." This is a reference to Michel de Montaigne, the French philosopher, 14th, 15th century in France. As I recall, very good. I recommend his book on his essays. Anyways, Montaigne, this is the quote that he takes from Montaigne. "It is not certain where death awaits us, so let us await it everywhere. To think of death beforehand is to think of our liberty. Whoever learns how to die has learned how not to be a slave. Knowing how to die frees us from all subjection and constraint." And that's a very interesting thing about death, because this sort of technocratic, fascistic nature of the measures, masks, social distancing, isolation, surveillance through track and trace, etc., all has inbuilt into it this idea of the fear of death. We have to do all these things because death is something to be fearful of. But as Agamben points out, well, what is life? All these measures, what they are doing to us, he goes on in the other chapters, is the fact that we're being relegated to a bare life, to a purely biological function. We're just biohazards, and we exist biologically. We eat, we sleep, if we're not working, we just exist in our houses, staying in, eat, go to bed, wake up, eat, the meaning of the minutiae of life, all the activities of life, of meeting people, of going to work, of hugging one's friends, of partying, of all measure of things which make us human, including death, the acceptance that we're born and we die. All that has been pushed aside to this holy grail of we shall keep death at bay at any cost, even the cost of humanity. Agamben says this is not feasible, it's not sustainable. And he goes on in this chapter, he says, we can only venture hypotheses concerning the forms that government will assume in the years to come. But what can be inferred from the current experiments is not reassuring. Italy, as we witnessed during the years of terrorism, is a sort of political laboratory where new technologies of governance are tested. It does not surprise me that Italy is at the moment spearheading the development of a technology of governance that, in the name of public health, renders acceptable a set of life conditions which eliminate all political activity, pure and simple. Remember the recent policing bill, the UK government, and the clampdown on protests, and people meeting generally in groups, pubs, parks, etc., houses. And he goes on, this country is always on the verge of falling back into fascism, meaning Italy's meaning. And there are many signs today that something more, so this is something more than a risk. Suffice to say that the government has appointed a committee that has the power to decide which news is true and which should be considered fake. As far as I myself am concerned, most major Italian newspapers refuse to publish my opinions. So he is being censored. And this thing about the fake news, what is true news, what is fake news, that is very prevalent in the UK as well. And it was very prevalent in the letter that I received from the Scottish Government, saying that the science that they picked out of all the masses of science out there in masks, that this science alone was the only science that was needed to be considered, and therefore we've got to put these on children, these masks. As I pointed out in my response to the Scottish Government, I said that this is not how science works. You know, and if you go in, you know, for example, if you went into a PhD Vive and you went, this is the science for masks and this is the stuff I've highlighted, the studies and research. Well, the examiner would rightly say, well, what about all these other studies that have shown oxygen deprivation, mouth infections, respiratory irritant from the fibres from mask, and yet the examiner was saying, and yet you're proposing everyone should be in masks all the time. Well, that's just obviously more research needed. You can't just put masks on people on the basis of this research. So, echoing Agamben, that kind of use of science is fascistic. And no doubt, I have no doubt that in time, governments will be held to account. Individuals who push this, the Debbie Schreiders of this world, the Scottish, the advisor to the Scottish Government, who was on television a few weeks ago, extolling the virtues of masks while exercising. What an idiotic thing to say. How dangerous to go running with a mask, to go cycling with a mask. It's difficult enough to exercise, to run, to cycle without a mask on. Without a mask on, and yet you've got to say to someone, "Oh, by the way, put a mask on and ride up that big hill on a bicycle." I mean, that's seriously dangerous advice to put out in national mainstream television. And it's inhumane. There's an inhumanity about it. One could say it's abolished humanity to a fascistic technology. And it takes me on to this other little snippet that I'm going to read to you by a book by Melvin Tinker. He's a vicar in England, somewhere in Hull, and this is a book called The Hideous Strength, a deeper look at how the West was lost. And as many people will know, The Hideous Strength was a novel by C.S. Lewis, which described a society, a technocratic, fascistic society where science guided every aspect of human life to the detriment of spirituality and God. So in this book, the section, The Abolition of God and the Abolition of Man, this section, this is what he says. He's discussing postmodernism. The end result of all post-structuralist philosophies of the likes of Foucault and Derrida, that's Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, of French intellectuals, both deceased now, is not the liberation of human beings but their destruction, the abolition of man through technology. Let us not be under any illusions as to what is at stake. Hannah Arendt, another philosopher, showed in her reporting of the trial of Hitler's chief architect of the final solution, Adolf Eichmann, that he and those like him were only able to carry out their atrocities by separating themselves from their victims, by denying the common humanity which connected them both. In the words of Carl Trueman in his essay The Banality of Evil, the possibility of the final solution was predicated on the abolition of common human nature. If there is no common human nature, it is difficult to see what basis there is for human rights. Why should this too be any less of a social construct, one which can be made and unmade by the dominant social class of the time? Indeed, for the cultural Marxists, such rights need to be formulated and given legislative force to impose the new liberty. There's so much in that that's pertinent to what's going on now. Human rights, the Nuremberg Code, the UNESCO Code of Human Rights regarding medical ethics, of informed consent to go along with some medical treatment, preventative treatment, whatever, masks, etc., vaccines. And the diminishment of life to this bare biological existence, to be a biohazard. So the abolition of common human nature, to be at risk, to live, to die, to be being towards death in a healthy way, an acceptance of this, the commonality of human nature, communing with other human beings openly. I mean, it's no accident that these gatherings have been abolished, in churches especially. And this reliance on so-called science, technology of putting masks on children, and having parents, schools asking parents to pick children up at the school gates wearing a mask. As some schools have asked this, and the parents can only come on their own, not with two parents, if there's a two-parent family, and they're not allowed to speak with other parents at the school gates. This is beyond science. Scientism, fascistic scientism. And so I'd like to end another snippet another interesting author that I've come across. It's only just come today in the post, so I've not really got into it, but I've read a few pages and it was very, very interesting. It's a book called The Power of the Powerless by Vaclav Havel. It's known to many people because he was the Prime Minister of Czechoslovakia, and he was successful in defeating communism in Czechoslovakia. And this is just the introduction. It's very interesting. I'll just read this bit out. Writing that The Power of the Powerless, a decade after the Prague Spring, Havel was less concerned by Soviet force than by Czechs and Slovaks' evident capacity for adaptation in high politics and in daily life. He was troubled by how the two could merge into what authorities called normalization, the new normal. Power was, as it were, and alternatives were unthinkable. Thinking was in any event discouraged. Like in the UK, we're not encouraged to think about or question in the mainstream media. We were encouraged through them not to think or make questions. Just take the jab if you're offered it. Just mask up, protect others, stay at home, save lives, don't question. So thinking was in any event discouraged. Czechoslovakian communists had no choice but to accept Brezhnev's doctrine, as President Brezhnev of the USSR, that any reform in a communist country justified Soviet invasion, and followed his line that a consumerist, really existing socialism was as good as things could get. The future disappeared along with belief in Marxism. Czechs and Slovaks were to be diverted by consumer goods, distracted by television serials, and demotivated from any sort of action in the public sphere. As we are with the clampdown and protests, people are very demotivated. In the self-violation of society of normalised Czechoslovakia, Havel saw a crisis of contemporary technological society as a whole, a modern unfreedom in which individuals enslave themselves because they do not ask themselves who they are and what they should be doing. It would thus be wrong to characterise The Power of the Powerless, published illegally in Czechoslovakia and Poland in late 1978. Fake news, dangerous news. Similar to today, isn't it? As anti-communist, in the time and place almost no one was sincerely pro-communist. Normalisation meant accepting the way things were without any argument about how they should be. And it was the suction of this vacuum that troubled Havel the most. Although European and American observers tried at the time, and might still try now, to classify the pamphlet as his book, The Power of the Powerless, Havel was engaging in something more fundamental. So I'll just say that again. Although European and American observers tried at the time, and might still try now, to classify the pamphlet as left-wing or right-wing, Havel was engaging in something more fundamental, a search for a pre-political that would allow people to get out from under ideologies such. Communism was a lie. No longer the Stalinist Big Bang of sacrifice of millions, now for a utopia to come, but instead the normalizer's black hole, that everything was how it had to be. For Havel then, the restoration of civic life began from truth. And of course, with the COVID narrative, it is from the mainstream and from certain government advisors and government officials, this is how it should be. This is how it should be. Normalization. Don't question. Demotivate people. Don't question. And this is where we are. This is where we are. It's not a political thing, really. As Agamben shows, he is from the left. And there's people on the right, so to speak, saying exactly the same thing. It's a pre-political. This is pre-political. Forget about this dichotomy, this binary of left and right. It's about civic freedom. It's about being human. It's a very, very apt thing, isn't it? Considering it's Easter. The idea of being human. This COVID thing is hell-bent on trying to deconstruct what it is to be human and bring up all sorts of divisive tactics, BLM, trans, vaccinated versus unvaccinated, maskers versus unmaskers, nationalists versus unionists. It's all divisive. In a civic society where freedom is allowed, we can be free to argue about different things, whether it's best to be independent Scotland or stay in the Union. There's no problem with discussing that, arguing about it, disagreeing with it. But we're not allowed to disagree with the COVID thing. And the science is not settled, as I pointed out with the masks. But the governments, the Scottish Government regarding the masks, they act as though the science is settled. And therefore impose upon our humanity and our children. Children don't need to be masked. People don't need to be masked. People are free to mask if they want, but it shouldn't be any obligation of any kind by anyone. So that's all really I wanted to say today. That's all. It's getting more and more difficult to make videos. I think because of how dark the situation's getting, it's getting more hard to struggle against it. But I think this is the ploy to make people give up and be demotivated. So don't give up the fight, even if you feel powerless. But I recommend this book by Giorgio Agamben. So take care. Thanks for all new subscriptions and likes. See you next time.